Showtime. Okay, hey there, folks. Even with conventions, readings, and other live events back on track, I figured I would keep bringing book tour to you. So, welcome to Russ's Rock and Roller Coaster, intriguing interviews with creative minds. So, for over almost 4 years, we've traveled far and wide on this show, from adventures across time and space, the depths of crime and horror, and the goofy moments in between. But tonight, there is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is the dimension of imagination, where together we will uncover one of the most influential writers of all time and examine the legacy of Rod Serling. On our panel tonight is my friend Mark Olshaker. Mark is an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker and author of 12 nonfiction books and 5 novels, including the absolutely brilliant Mindhunter, which was also made into a Netflix series of the same name. Mark is also a director of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation. Welcome back, Mark.
Thank you, Russ. Nice to be here.
All right, great to see you. Also on our panel is Nick Parisi. Nick serves as a president of the Rod Serling Memorial Foundation and is the author of Rod Serling, His Life, Work, and Imagination. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Russ. Great to be here.
All right, and last but not least, rounding out our panel is Rod Serling's daughter, Anne Serling. Anne is also the award-winning author of As I Knew Him, My Dad, Rod Serling. Welcome, Anne.
Thank you, Russ.
All right, great to see you. All right, so just a heads up to the folks at home. Feel free to send me notes or questions you have for the panel in the chat box during the show, and we'll get to a few at the end. All right, so like for many of us here tonight, Rod Serling's work has been a huge part of my life. But before we explore his various contributions, I want to take a little time to understand the man behind the stories. What I found interesting was learning about a man who was a paratrooper and a boxer in the Army in World War II, and unfortunately died relatively young of a heart attack. Now, of course, I'm talking about my own grandfather, Irving Teitelbaum, who I never met because he died younger than I am now, and he was a boxer and a paratrooper in World War II. Little did I know how much of these experiences reflected those of Rod Serling, and since I've learned all this, I've just felt extra connected. So, talk to me a little bit about Rod's life before TV and what shaped him. So, Anne, you're the best place to start. So talk to me about what was your dad like? Like, who was he as a person?
Well, as I wrote in my book, nothing like the public thought he was. He was not this dark, tortured soul that you see walking across the soundstage. He was very funny. Um, uh, Even as a teenager, I appreciated his humor, and my mother used to say to me, "Stop laughing. You're only encouraging him." But he was a prankster. He did an incredible gorilla imitation. Um,
Okay.
he was a terrific paddle tennis player. He was just a great dad. And even all these years later, there isn't a day that I don't think about him and miss him terribly. He was very concerned about social issues and racism, and I vividly remember him talking about prejudice a lot. It really pained him.
Yes, I have something to share with you in a minute. We're gonna talk about that. So, Mark, we've chatted about this before as you've been on the show several times. Why don't you tell folks about sort of your relationship with Rod and kind of how you found your way into his ecosystem?
Yeah, I knew Rod, and we were friends for the last 10 years of his life, which corresponded to the time from the time I was 14 years old to the time I was 24. I guess I was precocious in some ways of wanting to be a writer early on. I became absolutely fascinated by the Twilight Zone and the persona of Rod Serling, and as a result, I delved deeper into his oeuvre and started reading all of the old television plays and really fancied myself that this is what I wanted to do. And then it just so, and he became my real hero from afar. And it just so happened that at the time, he was president of the Television Academy of Arts and Sciences, and he was coming to speak in Washington, D.C., where I grew up. And my mother, who was an English teacher by trade, was working at the nascent National Public Radio station in Washington, which was then just called Greater Washington Educational Radio. And as a result, she was invited to this meeting of the Television Academy's local chapter, and she said, we can go to this, see your Rod Serling, which I absolutely jumped at the opportunity. And it was at the Sheraton Park Hotel, a big hotel in Washington. I came timidly with my paperback copy of Stories from the Twilight Zone. And when I got there, he and his brother Bob Serling, who was older than him and also a writer, mainly an aviation writer for UPI, was sitting at the head table, and I timidly went up, and that's my phone. We're very popular here. Anyway, and I timidly went up to him and introduced myself, asked him to sign my copy, and told him who I was and that I admired him. And we started talking, and he was just amazingly kind and generous and seemed to want to talk to me and all that. And I must say, I don't remember anything that he talked about, although I remember being enthralled by it. And I wanted to go up and talk to him again at the end. But he and Bob rushed out immediately afterwards, which kind of confused me. And the next day I read in the paper that he had gone right from there to the Washington Hospital Center because he'd been having chest pains the whole time and was concerned he was having a heart attack. Now, mind you, he didn't give any indication of this. He didn't give any indication to me, and there was no indication while he stayed and gave this very important address. So I didn't know what else to do, but being very moved, I sent a get well card to the hospital in his name. And within 10 days, I got a letter back from him on his personal stationery from California, thanking me for the card, saying it was the best medicine he had and all that. And from there on, I guess I just realized, okay, this is my opening. And I started writing back to him, and he would write to me. And we developed a friendship, more of a mentorship, I guess you would say, given the difference in our age. And I met with him many times over the next 10 years, either in Washington or California. This was before the days of cell phones, so we seldom communicated by telephone, although occasionally. And I can say, I can underscore everything Anna said. He was one of the most genuine, generous, intelligent, and funny human beings I've ever met. And even though Anne and I didn't know each other at the time, although we met briefly once before at her house in California, I was absolutely devastated when he passed away at the age of 50 of a heart attack. And I would say it took me a long time to get over it. Probably still haven't to, and I really think I patterned my career, such as it is, after him.
Wow. Wow. Amazing. Nick, what to the degree that I mean, you've spent many, 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 many years, involved in the foundation and researching and writing about him. What's your sense of the man before? I'm talking about before he became really big. What kind of person was he to the degree that you know these things?
Yeah, well, to the degree that I know them anyway. Yeah, I was 5 years old when Rod died, so obviously I never met the man. So, and the one thing I can, reiterate what Mark said. One of the things in researching my book was, it's amazing you going through Rod's correspondence, going through his letters and seeing the degree of care that he put into responding to every piece of mail that he received. He would respond to every piece of fan mail I think he responded to every piece he ever got. I don't know how he had time to write teleplays and screenplays when he was doing all this other writing, but he did, and it was just because that's the kind of guy that he was. That's the kind of man that he was. If someone took the time to write to him, and if it was a thoughtful letter, he was going to respond thoughtfully, and he was going to write back. And as Mark said, yeah, on his personal stationery, he would dictate his correspondence the same way he dictated his scripts, but he would he'd sign them personally, and so that's, yeah, the type of guy that he was. And as far as before he became Rod Serling, again, I feel silly a little bit talking this way with Ann in the room. It's a, but yeah, from everything I can gather, I mean, he grew up in Binghamton, New York, and Binghamton really shaped him. I mean, that was his hometown, and he had, from all, at least from his memory anyway, an idyllic childhood. He saw it as an idyllic childhood of just a childhood of if you have ever seen Walking Distance, The Twilight Zone, there's a childhood of summer and cotton candy and carousel rides and baseball, and he had a lot of friends. He was a gregarious kid and a gregarious man. He was a very personable guy, so he he always had lots of friends. He was one of the presidents of his high school. He was the editor of the school paper and the school yearbook. So he was involved in a lot of extracurricular things, the debate club. He liked to play sports, table tennis. He played baseball. So he was an active guy, and he was just he once said that he would like on his tombstone just to read, he left friends. That's what he would like to his epitaph to be. And it seemed to me from researching him that he went through his life making friends. I mean, that's what he did, and he did it naturally. He was a people person, and it's almost impossible. It is impossible to find anyone who had a bad word to say about Rod Serling. Everyone who worked with him loved him. Everyone who worked around him loved him. So that's just the type of guy he was. He was a warm, generous guy, and that's why people like the people in the foundation. That's one of the reasons we admire him so much.
Wow. And Russ, let me just add to what Nick has said. And Nick and Ann have both written probably the two best books ever written about Rod, each in their own way. And the thing you have to remember, and this is hard to believe if you look at the thickness of Nick's book, Rod's career, all the things we admire all these many years later, Rod's professional career was only 25 years.
I know, it's amazing.
Kind of staggering when you think about it.
And well, we're going to talk about that, absolutely, for sure. And you're right, it's incredible. So I want to share something. I usually don't do this early in the show, but I'm going to share my screen because this is to really give us a sense of the real humanity behind Rod Serling. And I think what I'm going to share says a lot. And I think, well, you'll see what I mean. So a while back, I saw this post. Anne, you tweeted this, I believe.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a quote from Rod Serling himself. Human beings must involve themselves in the anguish of other human beings. This, I submit to you, is not a political thesis at all. It is simply an expression of what I would hope might be ultimately a simple humanity for humanity's sake. Now, this to me just exudes a compassionate, deeply felt human being who looks beyond himself, and that to understand oneself, to understand other people is to understand oneself, and to understand oneself is to understand others. And can you give us a little insight into how he felt?
Let me set Anne up to tell a story.
Please.
And
please.
Anne and I have become very close, like brother and sister. And in any event, when Anne was writing her book, researching her book, she came to Washington, and I introduced her to somebody I knew, a man named Monroe Mike Newman, who had gone to Antioch with Rod. And he told a story about barbershops in Yellow Springs, Ohio to Anne. Anne, why don't you pick up the story from there?
Yeah, he got very angry if the students went to the barber who refused to cut African American people's hair. So you're right, Russ. This even at an incredibly young age, from everything that I've heard from other people too, he was very empathetic and caring, and I say this a lot, but it's quite true that my dad would be first deeply, deeply pained by what's happening in the world, and then apoplectic.
Yes. Well, we're gonna talk about that. I promise you. So that's a really, I mean, I thank you for sharing that story. I mean, to me, that just it's from what you've described, from what I've read myself, and what other people have said, this anecdote about him sounds like, a perfect example of really the kind of human being that he was. And we're going to talk about how that kind of fits into the way he expressed himself through his writing. We're going to get to the big one in a bit, I promise. But I want to talk about some of Rod's other significant contributions to fiction. And to start, I want to take a moment to compare what I consider to be two absolutely riveting movies, Passengers and Requiem of a Heavyweight. Now, thematically, they cover similar ground about men being confronted with their limitations and in different ways being forced out of their professions and dehumanized along the way. What do we think of these themes? Are they, for those of you who haven't seen it, Passengers is about an aging corporate executive, basically who's being told he's too old to cut the mustard anymore, and he's being pushed
Oh,
out.
excuse me, Patterns.
Patterns. I'm sorry, Patterns. Correct. I apologize. He's being pushed out of his corporate gig, but his owner is such a POS that he won't even just fire him. He just tortures him until he comes to a tragic end. And in Requiem of a Heavyweight, we have an aging boxer who's just past his time, and his manager, played by Jackie Gleason, who happens to be one of my favorite performers of all time. Sort of, he's played a role, if you've ever seen the movie The Hustler, where Jackie Gleason is playing Minnesota Fats and Burt Gordon is his sort of corrupt agent. Jackie Gleason's almost playing that role now in this movie. But anyway, and the boxer thinks that he might have a second chance at life, but then his manager sucks him down to the rabbit hole of misery and kind of really destroys his soul here. These were in the 50s and the 60s. So we're talking 60 and 70 years ago. To me,
Yeah.
it seems as relevant as today. But what do you guys think, Nick? What do you got? What thoughts you got here?
Yeah, well, those were themes that there were certain themes that Rod Serling explored in his work over and over again. He would take a single theme and attack it from several different perspectives. So he liked to take a single theme and see it through one set of eyes, and then see it through another set of eyes, and look at it from all different ways. And the idea of someone being past their prime and no longer being able to do the things that they felt they were meant to do, or that they were trained to do, was a favorite theme of his. And yes, in Patterns, it's the business world, and in Requiem for a Heavyweight, it's the boxing world. And Rod would say that, with boxing, as you mentioned, he did do some boxing in service. So it was a subject that he had some familiarity with, and he was able to dramatize that with a great degree of realism in Requiem for Heavyweight and in other boxing related stories that he wrote. But yeah, I tend to tie this back a little bit to his military service again. Rod Serling joined the military when he was a day out of high school, and he was barely 18 years old. And he came back and he felt like an old man. And I don't think Rod was alone in that. I think everybody who served especially in combat in World War II, came back feeling that they had aged beyond their years. And I think Rod certainly felt that he was older than his chronological
Right.
age was. So
Right.
he had an affinity for these types of characters who were older than they really should have been. So
Right.
you have a character like Mountain McClintock in Requiem for a Heavyweight, who is not old by our standards, but for a boxer, he's ancient.
Yeah, he's like what?
You know,
He's in his mid late 30s. For a
yeah,
boxer, that's old. But hell,
yes,
I would
exactly.
love to be in my mid 30s.
So when we all, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
and that's exactly it. So this idea of the I call them Serling's obsolete men, after the Twilight Zone.
Oh,
But
wow. right.
that's he would explore those obsolete men over and over again, men who felt that they had given all they could and they were past their prime, and now what do I do? What do I have all this
Yeah.
life left, but I don't know what I'm supposed
So,
to do
Anne,
now.
can I ask you, did your dad, did he ever talk about what the weight of being in the military, like what that did to him? What did he say about that?
Well, like most vets, he didn't talk a lot about it, but I
Mm,
have very clear memories of my dad having nightmares. And in the morning, I asked him what happened because I'd hear him scream. And in the morning, I'd ask him what happened, and he would tell me he was dreaming that the enemy was coming at him. But that's about as
right.
close as he came. And again, he's not unique in that. I
Sure.
have a friend whose dad didn't start talking about the war until he was 80.
So I
And
want,
yet, and yet he was very proud of that service. I don't think I ever saw him, probably Ann never saw him without his paratrooper bracelet on.
Well, I want to read something which really stuck with me because I did a rewatch, and as it pertains to the human frustration of feeling overwhelmed by forces greater than us. So I'm going to read this to you. All right. Okay. The enemy is an age, a nuclear age. It happened to kill man's faith in his ability to influence what happens to him. And out of this comes a sickness of frustration, a feeling of impotence, helplessness, weakness. And from this desperation, we look for a champion in red, white, and blue. Every now and then, a man on a white horse rides by, and we appoint him to be our personal God for the duration. Now, this monologue was from the script written by Rod Serling in the 1962 political thriller 7 Days in May. But if you were to swap out the word nuclear and replace it with digital, we could just as easily be talking about today. Um, Talk to me about, that. So for those of you who hadn't seen it, 7 Days in May is a political thriller where the current president is being ridiculed because he's trying to cut a deal with the Russians for nuclear disarmament, and there's a certain wing of the population that thinks he's being weak and they're setting us up for disaster. And a colonel plots against his own government to overthrow the president with this whole sort of conspiracy machinations. Um, doesn't sound a whole so dissimilar to the world that we live in right now. And this is from 1962. So this is 62 years ago. So talk to me a little bit about thematically, so with this, what is it about the human condition that Rod Serling seemed to understand that even then that we just seem to consistently forget or overlook? Mark, can you talk to me about that a little?
Well, I can tell you the same thing from my 25 years of writing about criminal justice. The human condition doesn't change. I mean,
Right.
Rod said this, what he was writing about was the same thing that the Greeks were writing about. And as Nick can tell you, one of the great things about 7 Days in May is it also showed Rod's ability to adapt. It was the book was written by two journalists, Fletcher Knebel and Charles W. Bailey II, and this was just a brilliant uh, adaptation. And what's ironic about it is the man who was planning to take over the country was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, in our last election cycle, you might say that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was one of the people who assured that the president could not take over illicitly. So it's kind of a reversal, but it just shows that everything that Rod wrote is just as relevant today. I think he would be just as appalled by the things that we see going on today in our society as he was by the Emmett Till case, which Nick can certainly talk to us about um, the lack of justice and the lack of treating people fairly. Prejudice, as Anne said, was the greatest evil in the world as far as Rod was concerned, and it's still with us, and people are still trading on it. One of the books I wrote recently was called "The Killer's Shadow," about the first, as far as we know, racially motivated and religiously motivated serial killer, Joseph Paul Franklin, who went around the country killing Black people, mixed couples, and Jews. And as the epigraph and the closing comments for that book, I quoted Rod's opening monologue and closing monologue from his Twilight Zone episode, He's Alive. And it couldn't have been more relevant in 2022 when the book came out as it was when it was first broadcast. When was that? Probably early 60s, Nick?
I think the first.
He's Alive with 63. It was season 4,
Okay.
so 63. Yeah.
So Nick, what about you? What is it from, in all your travels that, what was it about, the human condition to your mind anyway, that Rod Serling seemed to understand, again, perhaps thematically, it's been written about for ages, but, what's that old saying, the more things change, the more they stay the same, right?
Yeah. No, listen, I think one of listen, any great writer is going to have certain insight into the human condition. I think that's a prerequisite. That's if you're going to be a great writer, you're going to tell us something about ourselves that maybe we didn't know, or maybe we didn't never heard articulated in a certain way. So Rod was that was one of his strengths, and that speech that you quoted, from 7 Days in May. I think the really important part of that speech is the very end of it, because what Rod is saying, and what he's saying in context of that film, and again, it was an adaptation, but what he's saying is that when individuals feel a sense of not being in control of their own destinies, then they will look to a demagogue. They will look to the hero in red, white, and blue, and in this case, in the movie's case, it was General Walker, the character's name, and so he Rod knew about the frailties. He knew about our weaknesses. He knew about, when we feel this way, when we feel a certain way, we are going to be susceptible to the demagogues. And I don't think any of us have to even name names to know who we're talking about here. So I think, I've spoken with Mark about this, in that, there are certain parts of our population that I think Rod would sympathize with. I mean, Rod would sympathize with anybody almost, but he would sympathize with people who felt that they weren't getting the respect, or felt that they weren't in control of their own destinies. But he would then say, all right, but that's not the excuse to go listen to this guy who's saying he has it all solved in a panacea. Right. So he understood that, and that individual weakness. Rod addressed that again and again, the most famously in the Monsters Do on Maple Street. I mean, that's why it's an episode of Monsters Do on Maple Street, about the idea that as individuals, we can be perfectly fine, upstanding people, but we have this weakness in us that is susceptible to the mob mentality and the prejudice and everything else, and so that can be exploited.
Right. So, so again, did your dad talk about these things with you during your lifetime, about the, how man's fears could potentially be a pathway to greater dangers?
I don't remember specific conversations about that, but before I forget, I just wanted to add one thing.
Please.
Nick was saying my dad and he would say this too, that he had a very idyllic childhood, enlisted in the war the day after he graduated. And while he was overseas, his father died. And even though the war was over, my dad didn't have enough points to come home. And he was always very angry with the Red Cross for that, I guess, because they had made that decision. But so you take my dad, who had this incredible childhood, he goes to the war, he sees just horrific things, his friend getting decapitated, and just so he came home like so many vets, broken, and I think,
and with shrapnel in his leg too, right, Anne?
I'm sorry?
With shrapnel in his leg, which remained.
Yes, and his wrist and his leg, but as he said, he turned to writing because he was going to major in phys ed because he liked working with kids. But he switched it to writing because, as he said, he had to get it off his chest, out of his gut. So I think it obviously it was incredibly cathartic, like it is for most writers, but
right.
He still believed in humanity, despite everything that he'd seen.
Right. All right. So let's get to the big one. All right. So in 1959, the landscape of modern TV and fiction writing radically changed forever with the airing of The Twilight Zone. Yet this show almost never even made it on the air. Just I don't want to go into too deeply, but just talk me real quick about the struggles that it took just to get a show like that made at that. I mean, today, twisty, weird shows are everywhere, but we can track it back to one of its origins. Well,
This is Nick's wheelhouse.
yeah. So Nick, talk to me. So it's 1959. TV was a very different world back then, and now we've got when it was all cowboy shows and and Leave It to Beaver and that kind of thing, and now we're getting twisty sci-fi horror and nightmarish kind of tales. Like, how does that even happen?
Yeah, well, the how it happened is that Rod Serling made it happen because he had thankfully at by that point he was, and I say this at every every talk I give about Rod Serling because there are a lot of people who think of Rod obviously in terms of the Twilight Zone only and as if that's the only thing he ever created and the thing is that Rod Serling was without a doubt the most prestigious writer in television before the Twilight Zone aired. And the fact that he had that prestige, that he had won 3 Emmys in a row, and he had that, he had that clout, he was able to get something as kooky, as he would call it, as the Twilight Zone on the air.
So I want to show you some. So I've had this book, The Twilight Zone Companion. This book came out in 1982. It's been on my shelf since 1982. So I've literally had this very copy for 42 years. And I'm going to read something right from here. Okay. This is Rod himself. Let's not kid ourselves about The Twilight Zone. A lot of luck was involved in selling that to anyone. It was a show no one wanted to buy.
I think that's true, but I also think that Rod in that case may have been talking about a little bit earlier because he had really been trying to sell, or at least had an idea about something like Twilight Zone for years before 1959, but it was still too early. He did not have that clout yet to have something like Twilight Zone on the air yet. So if he ever, Rod even he knew what battles to pick, so he was not going to fight that battle in 1956 because TV was not ready for the Twilight Zone even 2 or 3 years earlier than it came on. That's and right. They weren't ready because Rod Serling didn't have that name yet. But again, when he had the chance to do his own show, he said, all right, I've had this idea for a while about something fantasy driven, science fiction driven. He always loved fantasy and science fiction, and maybe now I can do it. So it was perfect confluence of events that
he was able to sort of get it, let's say slip one past the goalie because he could write stories about this dark side of the human condition, but putting it in these sci-fi elements. It's sort of a way of saying, well, it's sort of over there. It's not really us, so the sponsors could feel safe about it. So just a quick interlude for those who came in a little late. If you have any questions or comments for the panel, put them in the chat box, and we'll get to a few at the end. Mark, you had something to say.
To elaborate on what Nick was saying, he said something to the effect of things that you can't have Republicans do, you can have Martians do.
But an alien can say things Democrat.
Right.
Okay.
Right. Okay.
But, as the senior member of this crew here, being older than both Ann and Nick, let me say I was part of the baby boomer generation, coming to the later part, but still part of it. And I would submit for your approval, that the Twilight Zone was much more influential in our generation than most people even imagine. I know Nick and Ann understand and agree with me, but my generation, as I've said in my writing, was a generation that was skeptical enough to believe that, idealistic enough to believe that anything was possible, and skeptical enough to believe that nothing was true. And that certainly, the Kennedy assassination and everything that came out of that in 1963 started that. But I think a lot of our sensibility, maybe even subconsciously, was shaped by the Twilight Zone, that things are not as they seem, that there is a dimension beyond, that there is a moral calculus that comes into every human choice and decision, and that we are not surface people, that there's much more to it than that. And I would submit to you that a lot of what came of the generation of the 60s going into the 70s was shaped by that sensibility created by the Twilight Zone.
Wow. All right. So one of my personal favorite episodes, among many, was actually the second ever episode. One for the Angels, in which a street side salesman sort of out hustles death to save a young girl. I mean, if you can outfox death, you've had quite a moment. So
Mm-hmm.
talk to me about one of you. I mean, there's too many to choose from to talk about them all. Okay, Anne, give
Well,
me give me
I
one of
was,
your favorites.
well, I was just going to say to that episode, it's a charming episode with Ed Wynn, who was so wonderful.
And who was also in the teleplay of Requiem for a Heavyweight, along with his son Keenan Wynn.
Mhm.
Oh, wow, okay.
Well, I loved Walking Distance. I also loved In Praise of Pip, and I wrote about this, that when my dad was alive, I didn't watch The Twilight Zone very much.
Hmm.
We always watch Night of the Meek, Christmas Eve, but I discovered In Praise of Pip when I was writing my book, and I realized my dad used some dialogue that he and I used. Who's your best buddy? You are, Pop. And
Oh,
as Mark knows, I sort of found my dad again in the Twilight Zone, watching that.
oh, wow.
That I can say that moment for Anne is when the private Rod, who she knew, and the public creative Rod came together, and it every time I read it in her book, it still gives me chills. It's just such a brilliant moment that she created.
Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's really that's a lovely moment. That's for you. I'm sure that must be just such a wonderful memory to cherish. So thank you for sharing that. Nick, talk. I mean, I know there's a lot to choose from. Give me one of your favorites. Come on.
Uh, when I'm forced to choose, I always go with Walking Distance as being my favorite. And again, for your audience that doesn't know, the Walking Distance is about it's very similar to Patterns in some ways. It's about a middle-aged man who's had he feels like he's past his prime. He's burnt out, and he all he wants to do is de-stress and go back home, go back to his childhood, and get on a carousel and just become a child again, really. And he goes back in time, and it's really it's a very semi autobiographical uh, tale from Rod about his desire to go back to Binghamton, to go back to his childhood in Binghamton. And the funny thing about it is that that I always loved that episode. Even when I was a kid, 10, 11 years old, watching it, I loved it. But as I've gotten older, it's obviously become even more poignant as you become as you get past middle age and just see exactly where that character is coming from. That hey, he just wants to chill out for a little bit, go back home, and go and remember what it was like to be able to go to a band concert, eating cotton candy, and it's just a beautifully written episode. It's a beautifully acted episode. One thing I let me go on a little bit of a tangent here. Just one thing about the Twilight Zone that it just makes it so great is that all the pieces came together with the Twilight Zone. More often than not, you had great writing, great acting, great cinematography, great directing. It was just a complete package. It was just a quality production from top to bottom. And Rod Serling has, a lot, obviously had a lot to do with that. He's the producer of the show. He wrote 92 episodes of it.
Narrated.
He narrated it. He was the on-screen host, and just these are little jewels. I mean, that's something that Rod would say. He says some of them were just little jewels, and they were, and Walking Distance is certainly one of them.
All right. Mark, what about you? Did you have a favorite or one of your favorites?
I have a number of favorites, but I think one of the ones we have to talk about because in some ways it's not characteristic is a very grim one called Death's Head Revisited, and it's about a former Obergruppenführer in SS officer who goes back to Dachau after the war,
Right.
essentially to reminisce. And while he's there, he is confronted by one of the prisoners who he had there. And he can't understand why the prisoner is still there, dressed in his prison striped uniform. And then suddenly he realizes that he remembers that he killed this prisoner. And then the prisoner and all of the others decide all of the ghosts of his victims decide to put him on trial for crimes against humanity. And I'll only say, for those who haven't seen it, that it's an amazing episode because Rod is able to create a kind of cosmic justice which is not available to here on Earth. It would be easy to kill this guy, but that's not what they do. And so the justice that they mete out to him is truly amazing. And one of the things that Nick can tell you is almost every closing monologue ended with, and the pity of it is that this is not only confined to the Twilight Zone, or look for this under T in the Twilight Zone. But Death's Head Revisited was so serious that the warning was that this could happen when monsters take over. And he said, and the pity of it is, this is not confined to the Twilight Zone,
Right.
but wherever men trod God's earth. So quite amazing. But like you said, like Nick said, there are so many good ones. And the other thing I'll mention, which Nick can pick up on, is Rod was a sentimentalist. I mean, no question. I mean, Nick mentioned Walking Distance and mentioned Night of the Meek. Rod was definitely sentimental, but he was sentimental in such a pure, genuine way that there's nothing cloying about it. There's nothing maudlin. This was pure human sentiment and emotion. And I don't know of another writer who just was able to hang it out there like Rod was, but with this kind of grace and courage and skill. And the other thing I'll say, and this is going into the other side, into Anne's side, I have never met a kinder, more generous man, so willing to give himself. I mean, I was a 14-year-old nobody, and he was world famous, and he essentially took me in.
Wow. So I want to touch on one more thing on the Twilight Zone. So many of the episodes dealt with feeling. Oh, actually, this is going to frame it up. I showed this before we started today. I just bought it. Just came today. So for those of you, I'm sure you can appreciate this. This is I ordered it. Just showed up today. It was supposed to be bigger than this. I saw it was centimeters, not inches. But anyway, a lot of the episodes dealt with feelings of isolation, loneliness, and mistrust. Not exactly warm and fuzzy. So why, even 65 years ago, when TV was this entirely different landscape, and you talked about it a little bit, Mark, it was an entirely different experience than today. Why did this show have such an impact then? And why does it still endure? That's really what I want to I just want to touch
upon. It got at human truths. Let Nick pick up on that, but it was about human truths.
Yeah, I think that's certainly one of the reasons it's endured. I again, something I say all the time is that if the Twilight Zone were just a collection of twist endings, if it were just it's a cookbook and it would just the invaders are from Earth, we wouldn't be talking about it right now. It might have been a cool show, and it might have endured for a certain amount of time, but certainly wouldn't be talking about it now, 65 years later. It endures because Rod Serling imbued it with these timeless truths about ourselves, about humanity, about the human condition. Right. And again, and just to get back to my other point is I really truly believe that the other reason it endures is just because it was just so good. It was so well done, so well written, so well. I mean, you watch these on Blu-ray, DVD, and they just look so beautiful.
The execution, for the most part, the execution was quite strong.
Exactly.
In lesser hands, it could have been sort of schlocky.
Yeah, and again, I wouldn't want to pick on any other shows, but the Twilight Zone is very often compared to The Outer Limits, a somewhat contemporary science show, and we're not talking about The Outer Limits. I mean, I don't mean right now, but we're not really talking about The Outer Limits the way we talk about The Twilight Zone, and that doesn't mean it wasn't a good show. It was a very good show, but it does not endure like The Twilight Zone because of Rod.
All right, so
I just wanted to add on to that. Times change, but people don't.
Mm-hmm. You're absolutely right. So I've seen the original, and for those of you who may not be aware of this, I've seen the original Planet of the Apes many times, including recently with my son. Yes, there's the big twist at the end, but Rod Serling wrote the screenplay for Planet of the Apes. There's the big twist at the end, but underneath it, once again, We're talking about horrors that we as humanity inflict upon each other, and the reality is that far more often than not, uh, far more often than we'd like, there just are no simple answers or clear paths forward. So, what role would you say that ambiguity plays in, broadly speaking, in Rod Serling's fiction?
It plays a tremendous role because that's what life is about. Rod realized life was complicated. I mean, as Anne said, he went from this idyllic childhood right into the war in the Philippines and into combat. And he realized that life was dealing him more than he had figured on. And when he came back, he really was a different person. And he realized that life was complicated and decided to write about it in all of its manifestations.
All right, so it wasn't until I really thought about it, but I think I would consider I think Rod Serling may actually be a truly underappreciated gem. Given his total output, I consider him to be one of the single most influential genre fiction creators of the last century, up there with Spielberg, Aaron Sorkin, and maybe just a handful of others.
And isn't it amazing that it's taken all this time for people to realize that by the time when Rod died in 1975, he had no expectation that we would be talking about him 40, almost 50 years later. And in some ways, Nick is kind of my legacy, my spiritual descendant. Um, Early on in my career, when I was, I think, 22, I decided I wanted to write a biography of Rod Serling and frame it in terms of the beginnings of television going up through the Twilight Zone. And I wrote to him and said, "What do you think? Would you be willing to work with me on this?" And he wrote back and said something to the effect of, um, "That's one of the greatest compliments I've ever had, but and you know, if you get any interest, of course." I'll work with you and I'll show you everything and talk to you about everything. But he said, I fear nobody really will be interested in this story. And unfortunately, he was right. I wrote a proposal, which he liked, and my agent sent it, this before I had any books published, and my agent sent it to a bunch of people, and they said, you know, what's the story? Why would we want to publish a book about Rod Serling? And look at all the books that are out there now. So in a sense, Nick has fulfilled the promise of an earlier generation.
Well, amazing. So, all right, that was great, guys. But now it's time for a special segment on the show where we spin the wheel. On the wheel are 7 possible categories, including a few new ones I brought out for tonight's show, and all relate to tonight's theme. Wherever it lands is what you get. And the categories are: The Truth Is Out There, To Serve Mankind, Book Flub, Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, Planet of the Grapes, and Name That Tune. All right, Anne, you're up first. You ready?
No.
Well, all right, whatever you get. So let's see. We're going to get no whammies here. And for you, we got On the Wheel. All right, name that tune. Okay, wait, I do this one every so often. I'm going to read you some song lyrics. You tell me what it's from. You ready?
Okay.
I'm falling down a spiral, destination unknown, double-crossed messenger all alone. Can't get no connection, can't get through. Where are you? What's that song?
Can I buzz in?
Of course.
Please.
Twilight Zone by Golden Earring.
There you go. Of course. I had to break it. I had to break that one out at least once tonight. Okay. All right, Mark, you're up next. You ready?
Yep.
All right. What do we got for you? All right, Mark, for you, we've got, oh, what's in a name? What is this one? My goodness, what did I do here? Okay. Where did the name come from for the Twilight Zone?
Well, that actually is somewhat disputed. Rod thought that he made it up, that he just thought it sounded like an interesting transitional phase. He later found out that it was a phrase that pilots used, and there are other stories too. But as far as Rod knew, and from talking to several people who knew him, they confirmed this, that he thought he made it up.
All right, fair enough. Okay,
I
Nick, you
mean, Nick
ready?
may have some more, so maybe able to add to that.
No, that's exactly what I would have said.
Yes,
Yeah.
actually. So I actually found it in this one. Of course, I lost the spot for it, where he talks about exactly. Hold on, I just had it. Of course, here we go. Uh, nope, that's not it. Well, anyway, he talked about being that kind of no man's land where pilots get lost, kind of
Yeah.
get lost in the fog, basically. All right, so Nick, here we go for you. All right, last one for you. We got, and we're going to get no repeats. So we got The Truth Is Out There. Okay, Mulder and Scully investigated all sorts of bizarre creatures and alien theories. If it turned out that they discovered that the human race was actually the byproduct of alien experimentation, would you want to know about
Mm.
Yes, I would want to know about it. But I don't know if there's a right answer to that question, is there? Yes.
I can add to that, Russ.
it? Please, please.
I once asked Rod, I said, do you wish that all these things that you write about on the Twilight Zone would actually happen in real life? And he said, yes, but not to me.
That is absolutely perfect. I love it. All right, now it's time. We're going to pick your poison. I got three choices for you, A, B, and C. I'm not going to tell you what's behind each one, but they're all related to tonight's theme. All right, Nick, you're up first. A, B, or C?
C for Cincinnati.
All right, so that is Benjamin's button. I like this one. This one comes up kind of often. All right, I'm going to give you two options. Much like Benjamin Button, you can live your life fully in reverse, where you are born incredibly old and then you get younger until you reach your cellular state. Or you can start over and relive the life you have now, only knowing that any changes that you make from your past, because you know how your life unfolds, will change your new life going forward in any number of unpredictable ways, likely resulting in a new life that's not going to look like your old one. So which is it? Life in reverse or life do-over?
Oh, I'd go back and do it over again and hope I don't screw things up, but I would certainly take that chance to try it again. Yeah.
All right, fair enough. All right, Anne, you're up next. I got A or B.
A.
All right, perfect. I'm going to give you some truth serum. I got 10 questions for you. You ready? All right. Watching The Twilight Zone, lights on or off?
Off.
Okay. Favorite guest actor on The Twilight Zone?
Jack Klugman.
Oh, that's mine. I love that one. Okay. Which stories do you prefer? Time travel or parallel universe?
Time travel.
Favorite night gallery story?
They're tearing down Tim Riley's bar.
Okay, for those who don't know, what's the gist of it?
It's a lot like Walking Distance, actually. It's about a man wanting to reclaim his youth, and um, it's a beautiful script.
All right. Which is scarier, unleashing a cosmic monster onto the world or being trapped in close quarters with one?
Mm. Both. Can I say both?
Sure. All right. Do you think there are alien races in the reaches of space who would try to annihilate us or enslave us if they ever made it here?
I hope not.
Do you think aliens from other worlds live among us?
Possibly. I don't know.
Do you think the government has secret facilities with alien technology?
No.
Are-
Well, I'm thinking of someone who might.
Well, that was not you hedged a little there, but okay. Are urban legends such as Sasquatch, the Loch Ness monster, and others what they're called, urban legends, or do you think that some of them are actually true?
Urban legends.
Okay, mankind's worst enemy, the forces of nature or mankind itself?
Mankind itself.
All right, Mark. So that leaves B for you. So reboot redux. The Twilight Zone been rebooted a few times, and other anthology shows have followed in its wake, but none of them seem to reach the consistent high bar of the original run. Do you see the original as just being one of those unrepeatable miracles, or is there a path forward for a new version of the Twilight Zone that could approximate the quality and excitement of the original run?
There is no path forward because until we can resurrect Anne's dad, it will not happen.
Yep, fair enough. All right, guys, we're getting short on time, so we're gonna take some questions from the audience. We got a whole bunch of them in here. So I just saw one that I thought was really great. Hold on. Okay, question for Ann. Did your father enjoy going to the movies, and what kind of movies did he enjoy?
Yes, he did. Um, it's funny. I have to admit, I on that TV show TNT Love Story was on the other night, and I caught the end of it, and it's pretty bad. But I remember my dad not hating it. So, what movies did he like? Oh, it's been a long time. I got to think about that.
All right, all right. So we've got here. So for the end questions, I was wondering, with everyone's personal relationships, interactions, and knowledge of Rod, I was wondering what's the lasting impact or message he's left with you?
Is this
Be
to me?
kind to each other.
Okay, okay, fair enough. And what about you?
Don't take yourself too seriously. And I think just caring about people, have empathy.
Okay, Nick.
Yeah, I think it would be along those lines. I think that we are other people. You know, we have to be involved with other people. That's it's about more than ourselves.
All right. So actually, I'm going to ask one quick question. I really wanted to get to because of everything we've been talking about. And is the Twilight, in your mind, is the Twilight Zone a pocket of madness, or do we live, or now given where we are now, do we live in the Twilight Zone, searching for pockets of sanity?
I think you can make that case. Yeah.
And
I
Yeah.
wish I couldn't.
it's often said we're living in the twilight zone, right?
No, well, I feel
It,
like
it's
I mean, if you remember, there was an episode that Nick can talk about called written by Richard Matheson called "Little Girl Lost," where a little girl ends up in another from her own bedroom ends up in another dimension, and I've always wondered if that's where we're all headed, or that's where we came from.
yes. Okay. All right, folks. So we're almost out of time. I'm going to share my screen. I got a few more goodies to share, and then we're going to call it a night. Okay. So, Anne, tell me, talk to me. What am I looking at here?
That's my memoir about my father, and it's available on Amazon.
And so, when did you write this?
Uh, I think it was published in 2013. It took me a long time to write this book. I'd originally started another book um, in his absence because, like my dad, I find writing cathartic. But I couldn't finish it because I hadn't even begun to deal with my grief.
Mm,
So I decided to write this book basically for three reasons. Again, to navigate my grief, to know more about my dad's professional side, and also to dispel rumors that my dad was this dark and tortured soul because
mm.
he was nothing like that. As I said, he's funny and kind and gentle and loved animals. And
Did you find that when you in the process of writing, did you find yourself A, rediscovering your dad in a new way, and B, discovering your dad maybe in some ways for the first time?
oh, absolutely discovered my dad and found him actually. Uh, I have a lot of letters that my dad wrote to and from his parents when he was in training camp before he was sent overseas. And I was torn apart by these letters because it sounded like letters a kid from camp would write his parents, having no idea what they're about to face in the war. And my own son was the same age as my dad was uh, when my father was sent over, and so it really punctuated how young these kids are that we
Right.
send away. And but I understood reading these letters and more about his relationship with his parents and what he went through in the war, and then more about the professional side, and which Mark helped me with that. And then revisiting, some of his writing as an adult now, sort of seeing it through my dad's eyes, I guess.
Yeah, yeah. Amazing, amazing. Well, everyone, please, I know everyone here is a huge fan of Rod Serling. I strongly encourage you to pick up this wonderful book that Anne has been so gracious to share with us. All right, Mark, talk to me. What do we got here?
Well, this is the first book I wrote with John Douglas, the FBI's behavioral profiling pioneer. Um, it was the first of, I think, 10 books that we've written together. It was the basis for the Netflix series. And um, I don't think I could have written this without the influence that Rod gave me and the insights that he directed me toward the human condition. And most of my career, both fiction and nonfiction, has certainly been informed by that.
Well, for those who have seen the show and you thought it was great, I can tell you I've read Mindhunter. I think it's even better than the show, and that's not a knock on the show. It's just how
Well, God bless you, Russ, and just go to Amazon or your local bookstore or wherever.
Yeah, I honestly I would put Mindhunter in my top 20, if not my top 10 best favorite books ever. All right. So, Nick, what do we got?
Oh, this is my book about Rod Serling's life and career. I always describe it as it's part biography, it's part critical analysis of his work, and it's part reference guide to absolutely everything that he ever wrote. So obviously not just the Twilight Zone, but everything before and after, and even the most obscure productions that he was involved in are addressed in this book to some extent.
Again, guys, if you I know you're fans of Rod's work. Please do yourself a favor and pick up this copy. You need to have it as part of your collection. Honestly, you just get those two together and you will have the definitive words on Rod Serling. All
Can
right.
I just add one suggestion?
Sure.
Mark DeWitziak has also written a book, Everything I Need to Know I Learned in the Twilight Zone, that I think people would also enjoy.
Absolutely. All right. Great. All right, guys. And as for me, and keeping in the spirit of pulp stories, conspiracy thrillers, and cosmic turns, I'll encourage you to check out Crackle and Fire. It's the first novel in my ongoing thriller series featuring hard-boiled private detective Angela Hardwick. In my mind, she is part Blade Runner, part Doctor Who, part Sarah Connor from Terminator, with a little Twilight Zone mixed in. In Crackle and Fire, Hardwick is hired by a young accounting executive to locate a missing intern who's absconded with stolen corporate files. But she soon finds herself getting mixed up, tangling with dueling gangsters, hostile protesters, a mysterious government agent, and a madman from Earth with galactic ambitions of his own. And if he's left to his own devices, well, it's going to be bad news for everybody. The novel also includes a bonus short story, which is one of my favorites that I've ever written. And I will also encourage you to check out the other books in the series, including Fractured Lives, Hot Ash, and Blunt Force Rising. And I just want to be clear. Each novel is a standalone thriller. They're self-contained plots where I reintroduce the world, building the characters, so you can jump in at any point and read them in any order. Crackle and Fire and the rest of the series is available on Amazon and published by Crazy 8 Press. All right, folks, I want to thank my guests, Mark and Ann and Nick, for being such wonderful and generous participants in talking about the legacy of Rod Serling. And I want to thank everyone who's watching at home. I'm your host, Russ Colchamiro. As always, and in the spirit of Rod, be generous of spirit, be gentle, be kind, and for God's sakes, go read a book. I'll be on spring break for a much needed rest for a couple of weeks, but I'll be back on the air starting Wednesday, April 17th for my final 5 episodes of the season. Until then, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I'll see everyone in a couple of weeks. Thanks, everyone. Absolutely great. Thank you. And bye now.
Thank you, Russ.
All right. Thanks, guys. Thanks for coming over. All right.